In my previous video, I covered the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Granted, it was rather limited in scope because the vast majority of them were in the Middle East. Only one of them was in Europe, which was the city of Argos in Greece. So in this video, I'm going to be covering some of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the European continent. Some of these are ones you are very familiar with, other ones are ones you've never heard of. So let's take a portal in time to Plovdiv. Unless you're from Bulgaria or located in a nearby country, you probably have never heard of this city before, but it just so happens to be the second largest city in the country after the capital Sofia, with a metropolitan area today that is over 500,000 people. However, what's far more interesting is that it's incredibly old. We usually associate Greece as being the oldest European civilization. However, archaeological remains in this city date back further than most Greek cities. In fact, it dates back to the Neolithic era, which was the later part of the Stone Age, in which humans were farming and producing the first settlements, roughly 6000 BCE. Keep in mind that when you go back this far, you really are dealing with ranges and dates that are rather broad, and you can't really talk about a specific year. For this reason, little is known about the first few thousand years. However, we do know that during the classical period, it was a town with a military set of fortifications run by a group of people known to the Greeks as the Thracians, oftentimes seen as barbarians, even though their quote-unquote civilization was arguably older. They would eventually succumb to the conquest of Persia and later Philip II of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great. The city would eventually fall under Roman control. The Romans had mixed feelings about this place. On one hand, it was quite prone to rebellions. On the other hand, it produced some of the best mercenaries for the empire. The Romans also built a great deal of infrastructure and a pretty cool sewage system, if you could call a sewage system cool. However, this rule did not last forever, and it was eventually sacked by the Goths, and then destroyed by the Huns, and then sacked by the Goths again. It would not be until the Middle Ages when the dominant linguistic group of Bulgaria today, the Slavic peoples, would arrive. This ethnic change, along with a strong military and cultural influence coming from the Byzantine Roman Empire, would solidify the city as a center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. However, this would not last forever. Eventually, much of Slavic civilizational customs would be outshined by Kiev and later Russia. Over a period of time, the city would face widespread instability over the events of the Fourth Crusades when Christians were trying to conquer other Christians, only to have their city overtaken by Muslims. The Ottoman Turks would eventually rule this city for around 200 years. The city, once seen as an icon of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, would be primarily inhabited by Muslims during this time. However, it wouldn't last long, as Bulgarian nationalism and a resurgence in Christian identity, along with a resentment towards Ottoman and Islamic imperialism, would result in the establishment of the Bulgarian Church, and a growing nationalist fervor, along with continued interest in reaffirming the use of the Bulgarian language. Eventually, the city and surrounding Bulgarian areas would become autonomous due to the treaty between the Ottomans and the Russians, who were fighting over the territory, treating it as a buffer state. Nonetheless, Sofia eventually became the capital. However, the city is still seen as a major cultural center. Next on the list is one that we've all heard of, Athens. I don't want to dwell on Athens too much because there are tens of thousands of videos that go far more in depth. This city dates back to the Mycenaean era, long predating the classical golden age of Athens. After the Mycenaean era, it's quite difficult to know what exactly was going on, given that that period of time is called the Greek Dark Ages, and the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. We don't really know to what extent Athens faced destruction during this period of time, so it's just kind of up in the air. What we do know is that the tribe that settled the city were known as the Ionians, and they were one of the four main Greek tribes. It's difficult to tell whether they were purely Ionians or a mix of the Ionians and another tribe, but nonetheless, they wanted to differentiate themselves from the Dorians, who had invaded the lands and would eventually set up the city-state of Sparta. Achievements of this city are way too long to name, so I'm just going to skip over much of their history that you probably are already familiar with and go to the next city on my list, Cardiff, that resides in modern-day Spain. You probably have never heard of it before, as it's located in the southern province of Andalusia. However, it far predates the nation-state of Spain, the Spanish language, or even the classical age of Greece. This city was founded by ancient Phoenicians who were native to the city of Tyre in modern-day Lebanon, who propped up a set of colonies around the Mediterranean. Eventually, the power of Tyre would be overshadowed by one of its colonies, Carthage, in what is now Tunisia. Carthaginians would eventually be locked into a series of wars against the Roman Republic, known as the Punic Wars, and despite the Carthaginian naval and commercial superiority for a period of time, the Romans would eventually take over the city and then sack Carthage afterwards. The city would eventually switch hands to the Visigoths as the Western Roman Empire collapsed. These were Germanic people groups, and they would eventually be taken over by the Islamic Moors from North Africa, before the Spaniards took it over through the Reconquista. During the height of Spanish power, the city eventually became a major maritime port. What is fascinating is that this city was once considered the furthest outpost of the known world, according to the Phoenicians. However, in the early modern history, it would be considered the starting off point into voyages into the sea to visit the Americas and the rest of the what was then unknown world at the time. Next on the list is Matera, Italy. It is one of the coolest ancient cities in the world, as it's built using literal rocks around the city. Not too much about it is known before its pre-Roman history. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the city would eventually be reconquered from the barbarians by the Eastern Roman Byzantines, an attempt to re-establish the former glory of the Roman Empire. Since then, the city by and large has been overshadowed by other Italian city-states, such as Florence, Venice, and Genoa, and by and large today is mostly a tourist destination in the Republic of Italy, despite its very old history. Next on the list is Durbant, which I'm almost certainly mispronouncing, and is debatably located in Europe. This is actually located in the predominantly Muslim region of Dagestan in Russia, close to the Azerbaijan border. While not a major source of historical importance in modern European or Russian history, its early days were quite fascinating, as in many ways it was seen as a gateway between the Eurasian steppe and European culture. Located on the shores of the Caspian Sea, the largest freshwater body on the planet Earth, the Persians would set up early fortifications and settlements. Eventually, the Arabs would conquer the city, forcing much of the Zoroastrian population to adopt Islam as their main religion. However, it did retain some strong cultural and linguistic resilience, dating back to the Persian Empire's early history. Eventually, the Russians would move in from the north, and there was a series of wars between the Russians, Turks, and Persians. During the 1800s, the land would be permanently, at least until this point, conquered by the Russian Empire, as Persian influence was on the decline. However, it has not gotten rid of its Persian ancestry completely, and most people here still claim some sort of Iranic ancestry or descent. And the region has also faced bouts of separatism that oftentimes get violent. Let's move on to Lisbon. So unless you are completely ignorant or failed 6th grade social studies class, you probably are familiar with Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, or at the very least have heard of the city. What a lot of people don't know is that the city was actually a Celtic place. Yeah, you might associate the Celts with Ireland and Scotland, however, they were by and large a linguistic group that made up much of Western Europe before Roman times. The Celts were not a unified monolith, but rather a collection of various tribes with similar languages and cultural practices. Eventually, the Phoenicians would set up a trading post in this area, only to be conquered by, well, the Romans, who were quite fond of killing Celts and Carthaginians alike. However, this city would eventually succumb to barbarian invasions when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and would eventually be taken over by the Umayyad Caliphate, the largest of Arab Islamic empires. This was the empire that stretched all the way from India to what is now Lisbon. Yeah, there was a point in time when the city of Damascus ruled over what is now Lisbon and what is now parts of India. Eventually, the Portuguese would team up with the Spaniards to kick out the Muslims, and the city would become great for exploration into the Atlantic. Portugal would be technically the world's first global superpower, as ships would sail all over the world from Brazil to Japan to India to Africa. However, due to a series of political upheavals as well as a terrible earthquake, its power soon faded. Let's move on next to one that we've all heard of, Istanbul. This city resides on 2 continents, Europe and Asia, even though they're technically one continent, Eurasia, but you get the point. Early settlements can be found in this area dating back to the Stone Age, but it's difficult to tell at what point it was permanently settled. We do know that it would eventually be settled by predominantly Greeks, known as the Byzantium. It would be seen as a sort of vassal state of Athens for a while, but it would eventually be conquered by the Macedonians and later by the Romans. One of the most important emperors in Roman history, Constantine the Great, would convert to Christianity and would make Byzantium the center of his power. This was very important due to its geographic location on a strait of the Bosphorus, which links the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. And when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Eastern Roman Empire, now known as the Byzantine Empire, would thrive under a golden age under Justinian I, and would survive around another 1,000 years. However, there were a series of problems, namely attacks by the Arabs, the sacking of the fourth wave of Crusaders, and eventually the conquest of the Ottoman Turks during the 1400s. At this point, Istanbul, the new name, once the center of Christendom, would now become the center of the world's last Islamic empire. Centered in what is now Istanbul, this empire would spread across much of the Balkans, Middle East, North Africa, all before collapsing at the end of World War I, leading to the modern Turkish Republic, in which Ankara was chosen as the capital and Istanbul remains as the major cultural and commercial center. Last on the list is one that you may have heard of, Syracuse, New York. Wait, sorry. My mistake. It's actually Syracuse in what is now the island of Sicily. As I previously mentioned, the Phoenicians and Greeks set up a number of city-states around the Mediterranean. The Greeks basically copied off of the Phoenician model and set up one powerful state, or city-state, or colony, if you could call it that, called Syracuse. There was a tribe on the Italian peninsula known as the Latins who would eventually found Rome. And with close contact with these Greek colonies, they would adopt a great deal of Greek culture, such as their gods, architecture, and togas, and their love of stabbing their political leaders. The Romans showed their love and admiration for the Greeks back by basically conquering Syracuse, and then the Byzantines would eventually come back to reconquer this area from the barbarians after the Roman Empire in the West had fallen apart. The Byzantines were Greeks pretending to be Romans, so I guess it all makes sense at the end of the day. The city would eventually be taken over by the Muslims and then by the Normans, who would eventually fluctuate into a series of little pissant states before eventually being taken over by the modern nation-state of Italy. This city can take pride not only in its incredible ancient past, but also the fact that it inspired the name of a gloomy, medium-sized city in upstate New York. And that's my list of some of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Europe. Obviously, there are plenty of others that I can include. If you have any ideas of cities that you'd like to include on the list, please let me know in the comment section. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, or if you hated it, just give it a thumbs down and leave a nice hate comment. Thanks for watching.